My in-laws claimed my unborn baby had no rights to my husband's wealth, so they erased my name from his life insurance. His mother snorted, "You were just a phase." They laughed at my tears. Until a handwritten note from my husband's safe changed everything. And got them banned from the estate. Years later, I met Damien Caulfield in the most unassuming way, browsing paperbacks in a tucked-away bookstore on Clark Street in Chicago. It was cold that day, snow piling up along the sidewalks, our breaths visible in the air. I was scanning the fiction shelf, minding my own business, when a quiet voice asked me if the book I was holding was worth reading. I turned around, and there he was, scarf loose around his neck, slightly awkward smile, tall and bookish with kind eyes. We talked about the book. Then about other books. Then coffee. The next thing I knew, I was meeting him again a few days later at that same bookstore, our unofficial halfway point between his campus apartment and my shared flat. Damien was a history professor. Polite. Observant. Passionate about obscure wars and antique maps. He wasn't flashy, but he listened, really listened. And after years of dating men who either talked over me or were only interested in temporary thrills, Damien felt like still water. Peaceful. Safe. I didn't know much about his family, other than that they were old money from Lake Forest, and that they had expectations. He didn't talk about them often, and I never pushed. What mattered to me was how he treated me. And that, he did incredibly well. We got married in a small ceremony at a botanical garden just outside of Evanston. His family didn't come. They sent an expensive silver serving set and a terse note instead. Damien said it was better this way. I agreed, at the time. Looking back, I think that was the first red flag I chose to ignore. The first and only time I met his mother, Genevieve Caulfield, was at a charity fundraiser we were invited to by someone on Damien's faculty board. Genevieve was already there when we arrived. She was tall, commanding, with stiff posture and a permanent look of mild disgust. Think 1950s socialite meets steely politician. She extended her hand to me like I was an intern and said, "Ah, so this is the wife." "Not your wife. Just the wife." Like I was a temporary prop. I smiled and reached out anyway. She barely touched my fingers. That night, in the car, Damien apologized over and over. Said she was difficult. That he'd always been the disappointment because he chose education over hedge funds. That she never forgave him for marrying outside their circle. "She thinks she can control everything," he said quietly. "Including who I love." 2 years into our marriage, I got pregnant. We were ecstatic. Damien started staying up late planning the nursery color palette. He read baby books out loud to my belly. He bought this tiny bear's onesie and said, "It's tradition." He even began reviewing his will, just in case. I had hyperemesis gravidarum. If you don't know what that is, imagine nausea so severe, it makes you cry every time you sit up. I lost over 15 pounds in the first trimester. Damien took a reduced class load just to be home more. He'd hold my hair back, rub my back, sit next to me in silence for hours. He was there. Through all of it. Until he wasn't. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon. Damien had just left for a department meeting. I was lying in bed, trying to keep down ginger tea, when my phone rang. Unknown number. "Mrs. Caulfield? Your husband has been taken to St. Mary's Hospital, we need you to come immediately." My world collapsed that day. I arrived at the hospital in a daze. A faculty staffer from his department was already there, wringing his hands. Damien had collapsed in the parking lot. They suspected an aneurysm. He was declared brain dead 26 hours later. I don't remember much of that week. Just blurry faces, flowers I didn't want, and people telling me to stay strong for the baby. I barely remember the funeral. But I do remember Genevieve. She arrived in head-to-toe black Chanel, veil included, and made a beeline for the front row pew, motioning to me to sit beside her. Like we were all part of one big, happy family. I sat because I didn't have the strength to protest. Later, at the post-service reception, she whispered, "I trust you'll handle his affairs with sensitivity." It wasn't a suggestion. It was a warning. 2 weeks after the funeral, I was asked to attend a family legal consultation regarding Damien's estate. It didn't feel like a consultation. It felt like a setup. I walked into a law office in downtown Chicago and was met with cold stares from Genevieve, her lawyer, and Blythe, Damien's sister, who had barely said a word to me since our wedding. They had found a loophole. Damien had never formally updated his primary life insurance or estate beneficiary after our marriage. His old documentation, which listed his mother and sister as next of kin, was still technically valid. And because the trust hadn't been officially modified to include me or our unborn daughter, they were contesting everything. "He didn't leave anything in writing to acknowledge your child," Genevieve said, not even bothering to look at me. "And no child has been born. As far as the estate is concerned, there is no heir." My mouth was dry. "He was going to the lawyer next week, he told me that." Her lips curled into a smile. "But he didn't. Did he?" They had prepared all the paperwork. I had been removed. From everything. Life insurance. Retirement. The trust. Even his university pension plan, which had a clause that allowed spousal benefits, only if formally updated. Damien had made verbal plans, but no signatures. "He was impulsive," Genevieve said, faux concerned. "I'm sure he didn't mean harm. He just got swept up." "You were a phase." I sat there, silently crying. Blythe whispered, "Don't cry. It won't help anything." They offered me a gesture payment, $20,000, to avoid complications. I walked out. And for the first time in days, I stopped feeling helpless. I started feeling angry. I went back to the loft that night, numb. The sun had already dipped behind the skyline, leaving the city coated in gray and orange shadows. My stomach felt like it was made of glass, tight, stretched, ready to crack under the weight of grief and rage. I walked through our space like a ghost. Damien's coat was still draped on the back of the kitchen chair. His coffee mug, still with a faint ring of black coffee at the bottom, sat untouched on the counter. I hadn't had the heart to clean. I told myself it was because I was pregnant and exhausted. But really? I just couldn't erase him. The next morning, I found myself standing in front of the closet. Not sure why. I stared at the old safe Damien had installed a couple months before everything happened. I remembered the day clearly, he had been so excited. "We're adults now," he'd laughed. "We have a fireproof safe. This is peak adulting." I hadn't opened it since. The key, he'd said, was behind the funny brick. It took me half an hour to remember what he meant. Then I found it, in the closet wall, behind an old shoe rack. A small silver key taped to the back of a brick panel that stuck out just slightly more than the others. I unlocked the safe. My hands were shaking. Inside, there were a few things: his passport, birth certificate, a signed copy of his faculty contract, and a thick envelope with my name in his handwriting. Alma. Just that. No 2. No 4. Just my name. Familiar, soft ink. I sat on the bedroom floor and opened it. Inside was a letter. Long, careful, and dated exactly a week before he died. "If you're reading this, Alma, something went wrong. I should have taken this to Jenkins by now. I know, I always say I'll get to it, and then I get distracted. But I want you to have this. Just in case. I want you to know that everything I have, I want to leave to you and our daughter." Yes, I'm saying daughter. I know it's probably too early to know, but I feel it in my bones. She's ours, Alma. You are my family. I don't care what anyone else says. I don't care what my mother says. They don't get to erase you. I've moved most of my private savings into the new joint account, check the Lake Forest Credit Union. You're listed as co-owner. I'll handle the rest with the lawyer, but this note should say it plainly enough. I want everything I own to go to Alma Rivera Caulfield and our daughter. If I die before I can say it out loud, let this letter be proof. I trust you. I love you. Don't let them bully you. I couldn't breathe. It was all there, his intention, his clarity, in black and white. No legal jargon. Just him. Damien. My husband. I brought the letter to my lawyer. She read it twice. Then again. It's not notarized, she said. But it's dated, signed, and written entirely in his handwriting. Combined with other proof, email threads, the joint account, the nursery plans, we can build a case. She brought in a handwriting expert who compared it with his will, old journal entries, and lecture notes from his office. It was a match. We had enough to petition for a hearing. When the Caulfields were served, they didn't take it well. Blythe sent me a message, through a mutual contact, saying I was playing dirty. That it was classless of me to use a dead man's words. Genevieve said nothing. But her lawyer filed an aggressive countersuit, claiming the letter was forged, and accused me, of manipulating a grieving man. I was called a liar. A gold digger. A fraud. All while carrying their son's child. It dragged on for months. I was 37 weeks pregnant the first time I sat across from them in court. Genevieve came in wearing a fur coat in April. Blythe wore sunglasses indoors. I wore a maternity dress that barely fit and compression socks. I remember thinking how ridiculous it all looked. Like they were trying to win a fashion show while I was fighting for my child's future. Their lawyer tried to pick apart Damien's letter. Said it was too emotional, too informal, not legally binding. My lawyer stood up and calmly presented a folder. Damien's emails to his lawyer, his notes about updating the estate, screenshots of our bank activity, photos of him painting the nursery. Even voice memos from his phone. One where he said, I need to leave everything to Alma and the baby. My family doesn't deserve a cent. That last one? It played in the courtroom. Genevieve's mouth twisted like she tasted something rotten. We didn't get a verdict that day. But I knew we'd won. 2 weeks later, my lawyer called. I'll never forget her voice, cool, steady, a little breathless. The judge is accepting the letter as a valid expression of intent. You're being reinstated as beneficiary. Full access to the estate, the trust, the accounts. The court is placing restrictions on Genevieve and Blythe's access, pending further review. My hands were shaking. I sat down on the floor. And then I laughed. It wasn't joy. Not yet. It was relief. Exhaustion. Vindication. I gave birth 3 days later. A girl. 7 pounds, 4 ounces. Full head of dark hair. I named her Dahlia Celeste. She looked like him. Right from the beginning. His eyes. His nose. His calm. When I held her in the hospital, I whispered, You're not a phase. You are everything. Genevieve sent flowers. I had the nurse toss them. A month after Dahlia was born, my lawyer filed a restraining order. They tried to show up, twice. Once at my building. Once at a pediatrician's office. Both times, they left with warnings from the police. They weren't just banned from the estate. They were banned from us. Time passed, but the bitterness they left behind lingered like smoke after a fire. Even after winning in court, even after Dahlia was here, healthy, breathing, real, there were still days I found myself watching the door, waiting for another letter, another ambush. For the first few months, I barely slept. Not because of the baby, though yes, she had her nights, but because every time I closed my eyes, I saw that conference room. The way Genevieve looked at me like I was something beneath her shoe. The way Blythe stifled a smirk when the lawyer called me Mrs. Caulfield, as though that title didn't belong to me. I hired a security system. Nothing flashy. Just enough. A camera at the front door. An alert on my phone if anyone came within range. Maybe it was paranoia. Maybe it was motherhood. Maybe it was just trauma. But I needed to feel safe. I needed to protect what was mine. And Dahlia? She was everything. Bright. Alert. Gentle. She had Damien's patience, rare in a newborn. There were nights she'd wake crying and stop the second I picked her up, staring up at me like she already understood the chaos she'd been born into. People always talk about how babies change everything. But they never talk about how they become anchors when your world has completely capsized. Dahlia gave my pain a direction. A reason. She gave it purpose. I started keeping a journal for her. Letters, really. Pages upon pages of things I wanted her to know. About me. About her father. About what it took to make sure she had everything she deserved. In one entry I wrote, "You won't remember what they tried to take from us, but I'll never let you forget what your father did to protect you, even after he was gone." Genevieve didn't give up right away. A few months after the restraining order, she filed a motion to reopen the case, claiming new evidence. It was a stretch. A desperate, thinly veiled attempt to stay tethered to the estate. Their so-called evidence was a voice message Damien left Blythe the year before we got married, saying he was thinking about taking a break from relationships for a while. That was it. A message from before we were even serious. Before the wedding. Before the baby. Their lawyer claimed it showed emotional instability and inconsistent decision-making. That it proved Damien wasn't of sound mind when he wrote the letter in the safe. Our judge wasn't having it. He dismissed the motion with a few blunt sentences and added an extended no-contact provision to the existing order. Genevieve left the courtroom that day without a word. But Blythe, ever the performer, turned to me as she passed and muttered, "You don't deserve his name." I looked her dead in the eye and said, "You don't deserve his memory." She flinched. Around that time, I moved us out of the loft. Not because I didn't love it. I did. That space held the best and worst of my life. But it wasn't meant to be our forever. Damien and I had always talked about a house. A yard. A quiet neighborhood where we could hear birds instead of car alarms. So I bought a house in Oak Park. Nothing extravagant. Just a modest, two-story home with a front porch and creaky floors and a kitchen window that caught the morning sun. I paid for it with the money Damien had left me. Not a penny more, not a penny less. I imagined him there. Every time I walked from the nursery to the hallway. Every time I sat on the porch with a cup of coffee. Every time Dahlia giggled in the bathtub and splashed water everywhere. It wasn't what we planned. But it was something close. I kept the letter from the safe. Framed it, actually. Had it mounted behind UV-protected glass and hung it in my office, right above my desk. I reread it whenever I felt doubt creep in. Whenever I missed him too much. Whenever I heard whispers from people who didn't know the full story and thought I had gotten lucky. No. I didn't get lucky. I fought tooth and nail. I nearly broke. But I didn't. And that letter wasn't luck. It was love. It was forethought. It was proof that even when the law failed us, Damien hadn't. Genevieve went quiet for a while after the court loss. Rumor had it she'd started liquidating some of her art investments. She'd lost her social board position after one of the judge's wives heard about the estate drama. Reputation matters in Lake Forest. She tried to host a gala 6 months later and not a single reporter showed. Blythe kept posting on Instagram like nothing happened, brunches, Pilates, trips to Italy. But even through the filters, there was a shift. Less tagging of luxury brands. Less sponsored content. Her engagement ring disappeared in one post, and when someone asked, the comment was deleted. I didn't comment. I just watched. Sometimes silence is the best kind of justice. About a year after Dahlia was born, I received a thick envelope in the mail. No return address. But I recognized the handwriting. Inside were photographs. Damien. As a child. A teenager. A young man. Photos I'd never seen. Him riding a pony in the Hamptons. Blowing out candles on a yacht cake. Holding a baby Blythe with a stiff, uncomfortable smile. And one, just one, of him as an adult, standing in the Caulfield Estates garden, looking directly at the camera, arms crossed, unsmiling. There was no note. Just the photos. I stood there for a long time, flipping through them. Trying to decide if this was a peace offering. A threat. Or a reminder. I scanned the adult photo and placed it next to one I had of him holding Dahlia in the hospital, only hours after she was born. Same arms. Same jawline. Same eyes. But in our photo, he was smiling. Years passed. The sharpest edges of grief dulled, but they never fully disappeared. I got used to the ache, like a quiet hum in the background of my life, always there, but not always loud. Dahlia grew fast. Too fast. 1 minute she was wobbling her first steps on the creaky hardwood floor in Oak Park, and the next she was walking confidently into her kindergarten class, her ponytail bouncing behind her like she owned the world. She had Damien's calm. His thoughtfulness. She liked books more than cartoons, colors more than dolls. She was quiet, but not shy. Intentional. Even her teachers said she had an old soul. Every night, we'd read. Every weekend, we'd bake something messy and unrepeatable. Every year on Damien's birthday, we'd light a candle and she'd draw him a picture, always in blue, always with stars. I kept the name Caulfield. I never changed it back. Not because of what it meant to them, but because of what it meant to me. Because of what Damien made it mean. For Dahlia. I wanted her to grow up with pride, not shame. With truth, not whispers. But the Caulfields? They didn't stay buried forever. When Dahlia was 9, I got an email. From a man named Franklin Dorsey, a financial investigator in the Lake County Probate Division. Cold. Clinical. Asking for a brief meeting regarding archived trust activity from the Caulfield estate. I didn't like the sound of it. We met in a cafe. I brought all the documents I had, copies of the court rulings, the original letter, everything. He reviewed them silently, then looked at me and said, "You're not in trouble. But you should know, Genevieve Caulfield is." Apparently, after her public fall from grace, she'd been quietly moving funds around, selling off parts of the estate that she no longer owned outright. Art, land, family heirlooms. Some of which, by law, had been locked into the trust Dahlia was entitled to inherit. She'd been selling them anyway. Illegally. For years. Her mistake? One of the antique pieces, a 19th century sculpture, had been donated to a museum, in my name. She tried to pass it off as a symbolic gift from the family, but the donation paperwork listed the Alma Rivera Caulfield Family Trust as the legal owner. Which meant she'd been using my daughter's trust assets to quietly fund her own ego projects. It took everything in me not to laugh right there in the cafe. We took her to court. Again. This time, the gloves were off. The evidence was overwhelming. Receipts. Bank transfers. Emails. Even an assistant who turned whistleblower. Genevieve tried to argue she didn't understand the terms of the trust, that she thought she still had managing rights. But the judge, same one from the original hearing, by poetic coincidence, wasn't buying it. "I told you years ago," he said plainly. "The estate does not belong to you. We won full control. Not just over what was left in the trust, but over any residuals, proceeds, or items sold under false pretenses." Genevieve was fined. Heavily. Her accounts were frozen pending restitution. But the real victory? The Caulfield estate, the massive Lake Forest property with its manicured rose gardens and cold marble halls, was ordered to be sold. The proceeds? Deposited directly into Dahlia's education and inheritance accounts. I didn't step foot on the property the day it went up for auction. But I saw the photos. The heavy front gate. The empty halls. The Caulfields had fought so hard to keep me and my daughter out of that house. Now they couldn't even set foot inside. The final act of revenge didn't come with shouting or courtrooms. It came quietly. When Dahlia was 12, she was invited to speak at a school event about someone who inspired her. Parents were invited. I sat in the third row, surrounded by proud moms and dads in slacks and sweaters. She stood at the podium, her voice steady, and said, "My dad died before I was born. But he left something really important behind. He left my mom. And my mom taught me that love isn't something people can erase. Not even rich people with lawyers." There was a long pause. She fought for me before I could even talk. So when people ask me who inspires me, I always say, my mom. Because when everyone else gave up, she didn't. The applause was loud. But what I heard most was her voice. Strong. Sure. Unafraid. Genevieve moved to New York after losing the estate. Blythe married a tech startup guy and faded into social media obscurity after one too many sponsored content violations. I never heard from them again. Never needed to. My daughter grew up safe, loved, and with every opportunity her father wanted her to have. I kept the framed letter in our new home, right above the fireplace. The fireproof safe now holds her college documents, a lock of her baby hair, and the tiny bear's onesie Damien once held up to the light like it was holy. They told me I was a phase. But love, real love, doesn't fade. It leaves behind roots. And those roots? They built a future no one could take from us.